Hi everyone, I'm Maria McLachlan. Talk radio is not a station I listen to. I don't listen to the radio at all, in fact, unless I'm directed to something specific. So James Max is not someone I've ever heard of before. I'm sure many of you will have received notification of his extraordinary exchange with Kellie-Jay, which is now available to watch on YouTube. I'll link below. This is how it was promoted by the Talk Radio Twitter account. Campaigner Kellie-Jay and James Max clash over the issue of sex-based rights and J.K. Rowling's trans row. James: I am slightly staggered by your views. Kellie-Jay: what, that biological sex exists? And James Max retweeted that, calling it unbelievable, which it absolutely was, but not for the reasons James seems to think. Feminist legend Alison Bailey nailed it with this response: yes, your ignorance really was unbelievable. Of course, lots of people are blissfully ignorant about what goes on outside their bubbles. If they see the word transgender in a headline, they probably yawn and turn the page. But this guy is a broadcaster, a journalist specialising in current affairs, commenting on the biggest cultural clash of our time. And it was obvious he doesn't have a clue, not a Scooby-Doo. He hit back at Alison with, my ignorance in that trans people should be recognised or have rights, is that ignorance? You'd think from that response that James had been offering a cogent argument as to why trans people should be recognised and have the right to be accepted as the other sex in all circumstances. But he didn't. What he did was demonstrate his ignorance, and it was painful to be reminded of how ignorant some people are. And as I said, as a broadcaster, he has no excuse for being so lamentably uninformed about what we've been saying for years now. So it starts with James mentioning that J.K. Rowling isn't expected to attend the 20th anniversary Harry Potter reunion that everyone else is going to. He then introduces Kellie-Jay and asks her whether J.K. should have been invited to this event, or, given that her views differ from those of the little shits she made famous, obviously he didn't put it quite like that, is it right that she be kept away? Kellie-Jay answers that she thinks it's despicable to treat J.K. Rowling like that, and she gives all the obvious reasons. I don't need to repeat them. James counters this with,
and the other side would be, she's such an influential person, she's such an influential individual, that if she comes up with views, then the torrent, if you like, of abuse that can then be landed at the feet of those who are trans, because of the views that she holds, means that it makes it very difficult for them.
What views has J.K. Rowling come up with that could possibly provoke anyone into abusing any trans person? And where has this happened? Give us a single verifiable example of anyone being abused as a direct result of this, or this, or this, or what she said in her essay. I showed this at the end of my last video on Ty Turner. Or anything that J.K. Rowling has said anywhere. You haven't got one. This is the same crap that we hear time and again about how feminists, by disagreeing with gender ideology, are directly responsible for violence and murder. Et voila. I wonder how many I've killed. Of course, the kind of people who assault and want to kill trans-identifying people are inspired by feminism and not by hatred of difference and non-conformity. The person who has received torrents of abuse, probably more than anyone else who's come up with views relating to this topic, is J.K. Rowling herself. And that abuse, which is some of the worst I've ever seen, has come from trans-identifying people and their allies. James then mentions someone who's just died, using this person, who was a man who lived as a woman, as a case study of what happens when a trans person is outed. Let's watch Kellie-Jay's response.
What's that got to do with J.K. Rowling saying that women are adult human females and deserve rights? What on earth is that? What has that model got anything to do with J.K. Rowling? If somebody says that they're a female and they're not, and they get found out, then they've been dishonest. Does it mean that they should lose their livelihood? Absolutely not, depending on obviously what that job is.
So Kellie-Jay follows this, repeating, but I don't really understand what this has got to do with J.K. Rowling. Well, nor do I, and unfortunately we don't find out. James responds with,
well, it's got everything to do with it.
And then he just repeats what he's already said about the man who's just died.
And then when she was exposed as having been originally born as a man as opposed to the woman that she portrayed, then her life was kind of over and the discrimination started.
Let me tell you something about this person who's just died and who was known as April Ashley. On my website, I tell my personal Pete Tran story, and I relate that April Ashley was the first person I'd ever heard of who'd been a man and who had somehow magically turned into a woman. I was in my early teens and I was quite bewildered by this story, which made the TV news in 1970. The reason it made the national news at that time was because some years earlier, I think it was about 1963, April Ashley married a man. And this, of course, was decades before same-sex marriage became legal. The man April married happened to be an English aristocrat, and he knew full well that April was a man. He himself was a cross-dresser. The marriage didn't last 5 minutes. Sorry, that's wrong. It lasted a whole 14 days before April ran away, and sometime in the mid-60s, around the time J.K. Rowling was born, April Ashley's lawyer wrote to the husband. I can't remember his name, but he eventually became Baron blah blah shithouse door or something equally preposterous. Anyway, April's lawyers demanded maintenance payments, and in response, the Baron Shithouse Door filed for an annulment on the grounds that the marriage had not been legitimate in the first place because April was male. Finally, in 1970, he got his annulment and it made prime-time news. I remember it vividly, not the details of the story, but the footage of April posing with a flower, because that's what ladies do, don't you know? They will sit around sniffing flowers all day, and even as a 13-year-old, it annoyed the crap out of me. Now, according to James Max, once April Ashley was rumbled, his life was kind of over. Kind of over? The dude lived until the age of 86. He only died a few days ago, and in fact, far from his life being over, April Ashley went on to marry again in the 1980s. He ran a restaurant, he wrote a book, he had a succession of friendships, possibly more, with various male celebrities, and he was awarded an MBE by Her Majesty the Queen. But what the hell has any of that got to do with J.K. Rowling? We are not told because, unfortunately, the conversation gets diverted onto bloody pronouns.
Well, do you call him him or her?
Yes, you heard that correctly. Do you call him or her?
Totally him.
You see, that's the problem, because they were born a man and then they became a woman, so they can never be her.
If listeners to this talk radio programme had not yet realised that James Max is totally out of his depth, they surely did so now. Kellie-Jay responds that no man can ever become a woman, and we get this.
So then there's the problem, isn't it?
What, not lying?
Well, it's not a question of not lying, it's a question of not necessarily understanding that somebody can be born in somebody else's body.
Right, this has become excruciating. Somebody can be born in someone else's body. So the body I was born into might have been intended for someone else. Now, I'm being unfair to this journalist who obviously hasn't prepared for this story, this interview at all, and that is why he hurriedly seized on the newly published but totally irrelevant obituary of April Ashley, and he tries to make something out of Ashley's life that will fit into the narrative he's trying to create about discrimination against trans-identifying people. Most of Ashley's life was in a previous era, before the Gender Recognition Act, before widespread institutional capture of gender bollocks, and before all the rights and privileges that trans-identifying people enjoy today. A complete non sequitur and desperate barrel scraping. What he meant was this.
In the sense that you can be born physically a man or a woman, but inside you may be, and it has been recognised, that you might yourself be an opposing sex in terms of how your brain works.
What I'd like to know from James Max and every other person who has ever made this claim, and believe me, I have asked this question of such people many times, and I've yet to receive a response, is what exactly goes on in the brain of someone with a male body but who insists he's a woman? What are the thoughts and ideas that are occurring that might make him believe he's a woman? I'm very curious about this because so many men who insist they are women are the blokiest blokes imaginable. I've talked about this before. James obviously hasn't seen my video on autogynephilia, which is very remiss of him.
No, I'm saying what you've just said there is absolute nonsense. There's no way that you can be, you are your body. There is no separation between your biological sex.
No, you see, I'm afraid that's wrong.
No.
What? That's it? Just that's wrong? You don't have an argument to offer? Any scientific research to cite? We're just supposed to take your word for it? Truth by stipulation again. No wonder Kellie-Jay laughed derisively. She then asked him how it can be possible, how it can possibly happen that a man ends up with the so-called lady brain. I mean, she doesn't put it like that. She's more sophisticated, talks about DNA and building cells, but that is basically what she asked. And James could not answer. He was floored. So instead, he starts ad homing her.
Well, that's not necessarily. I mean, are you an expert in this?
Well, I'd probably say I was more of an expert than somebody who thinks you can actually.
Well, you're just telling me that you're an expert because you're female.
Oh my God, you're putting words in her mouth now, James.
And therefore...
No, you use the word expert. I didn't use the word expert. You did.
Exactly. James then went on to make the extraordinary claim that doctors who are experts do say that people can be born in the wrong body. Kellie-Jay quickly shuts that one down because it's nonsense. I mean, obviously some doctors are quicker to diagnose what is most commonly called gender dysphoria and to prescribe affirming treatment than are others. But nobody says what James quite specifically claimed, they say. I'll skip the bit where James asks if you can be born gay. As Kellie-Jay said on her channel last night, he intended it as a gotcha, but her response left him floundering. So he goes back to this.
Okay, and so you don't think that you could be born female, but in fact, in terms of how you operate, you are a man?
No, I think you can probably be born any sex and behave in any way, and that doesn't really change your biological structure.
So Kellie-Jay says we can be born either sex and be any way. That doesn't change biology. Bear that in mind for what James says in a moment. First he says this.
But isn't that because you are certain on who you are, in the sense that I'm pretty certain on who I am, and therefore we can come at this subject with the knowledge and the experience that we have?
Does James have the cult playbook open in front of him? James, we all know who we are. We all know our own names. We know when and where we were born, and most of us know who our parents are. This isn't about who we are, it's about what we are. And are you saying that some people don't know who they are? No, he isn't. What he goes on to say is in stark contrast to what he said earlier. Remember, he said,
well, it's not a question of not lying, it's a question of not necessarily understanding that somebody can be born in somebody else's body.
Now he says,
but you can never be in the body, in the mind, in the brain of somebody else.
Thank you, James. Even though you've been talking nonsense from the outset, at least it was consistent nonsense. Now you're contradicting yourself within the space of a few minutes. It gets worse.
And in fact, by saying the things that you're saying is pretty hateful, pretty disturbing.
And there we have it. Saying that we can be born either sex and be any way, that doesn't change biology, is hateful and disturbing. James, are you completely nuts? I have a boiling point, and we've just reached it. The things he says from here on are so dumb, they beg a belief. So I urge you to watch the video if you haven't done so and see how well Kellie-Jay does in the face of his absolute nuttiness. I'll only show you one more bit of it.
Okay. I am slightly staggered by your views on the basis that...
that biological sex exists.
I may have to change my mind. Maybe it was right that if you take those views, maybe you should be cancelled.
Wow.
Wow, indeed. James, you have surely just incinerated whatever credibility you might have had. Well, he probably hasn't, actually. He's probably got all the pseudo-fascists of the gender cult going, yay, right on, bravo. I mean, I guess it's his job when talking about a controversial subject to try to bring some of that controversy to life for his audience. But is it worth looking a complete bellend over? If I was connected to James, I'd be mortified. But on the plus side, he has probably done more to hurt the gender cult and to boost Kellie-Jay's popularity than he ever intended to. So kudos to Kellie-Jay for wiping the floor with him, and, by the way, to Debbie Hayton for what he said to James Max this morning. That was tweeted just before I started filming, and I'll link to that below. Thanks for watching. Bye.